Settle in. Let the day dissolve behind you. The world outside may be noisy or cluttered with thought, but here in this quiet hour, you are invited to drift backward through time. Close your eyes, if you wish. Let your breath slow. Let your muscles loosen. Allow the past to gently unfurl, like the pages of a worn parchment scroll. Tonight, our journey takes us far, far away into the orderly yet perilous world of ancient Rome. Not the dramatic Rome of battlefield glories or mad emperors, but the slower, quieter pulse of a civilization where loyalty was prized above all, and betrayal carried a price as chilling as it was methodical. We will wander the colonnades of Roman life, observe the daily patterns of common citizens and elite rulers alike, and in quiet tones, trace the threads of power, suspicion, and justice ending. Eventually, in the cold logic of punishments designed not just to end a life, but to leave behind a message. This is not a tale of thrills or horror. It is the anatomy of treason in Rome, told with the hush of hindsight, softened by time, and held gently in the half-light of memory. You needn't stay alert should sleep call. Let it come. The story will wait for you. So, imagine yourself stepping out onto the cool stone of a Roman street, the early light brushing across your skin, as the world of 2,000 years ago slowly begins to awaken. Long before accusations, trials, and sentences, there was simply life. To understand treason in Rome, we must begin not with the accused, but with the ordinary, with the rhythms of daily Roman existence, where loyalty was not just a virtue, it was the very fabric of survival. Imagine the heart of a Roman city in the 1st century CE. The streets are narrow and paved with uneven stones, worn smooth by years of sandals and wagon wheels. Merchants are just beginning to open their wooden shutters, the scent of baking flatbread drifting faintly into the morning air. A woman, wrapped in a simple stola, carries a clay amphora from a public fountain. A boy chases a stray dog near the entrance of a crowded insula, one of the city's many apartment blocks, creaking with life and voices behind thin walls. In such a place, each citizen, freedman, or slave played their part in the structure of Rome. The empire was vast, stretching from misty Britannia to the sands of Arabia, but it was built and preserved by the small acts of everyday obedience, paying taxes, speaking with proper respect, displaying loyalty to the emperor's image, which gazed out from coins, statues, and painted frescoes. Even the mundane was politicized. A man might raise his cup in salute to the reigning Caesar at a dinner gathering, not because he adored the emperor, but because not doing so might earn a whisper of suspicion. That whisper, like smoke, could drift upward to more dangerous ears. Public life and private thought lived in delicate balance. In the crowded forum, citizens debated law and philosophy, but even here, caution lingered. One never knew who might be listening. Satire was permitted sometimes. Criticism of imperial authority was not. And so, in the bustling wash of voices and footsteps, loyalty was both visible and invisible. It was expressed in ritual, language, gesture, and presence. It became, over time, part of the air one breathed. Even in the countryside, the watchful eye of Rome extended its influence. A farmer tending olive groves in the hills near Latium might rarely see a senator, yet he knew whose law governed his land, whose armies defended his safety, and whose displeasure could mean ruin. Loyalty, then, was not merely an abstract principle. It was enforced through every layer of life. The Roman state, elegant in its legal codes and efficient in its reach, created a world where one's place was determined by reputation, allegiance, and the careful avoidance of offense. For a society that valued dignitas, a person's standing in the eyes of others, treason was not simply a crime against law. It was a rupture in the moral order, a breaking of trust with Rome itself. And in this slow and intricate web of duties and obligations, the seeds of accusation could quietly take root. One careless phrase, one association with the wrong faction, one delayed response to a summons. It did not take much. But all of that, the suspicion, the trial, the punishment, would come later. For now, as the sun climbs higher over the tiled rooftops and the sounds of a waking city swell gently in the distance, we rest here, among the people, the merchants, the scholars, the laborers, and the dreamers, and we listen, softly, to the heartbeat of a Rome that lived on order, silence, and unspoken fears. As we drift gently forward through the folds of Roman history, we begin to see not just the patterns of daily life, but the individuals caught in the empire's vast machinery, those whose names remain etched in stone or papyrus, not because they lived quietly, but because they did not. Treason in Rome was rarely just a matter of betrayal. It was often deeply personal, wrapped in ambition, rivalry, or mere proximity to power. And those who fell afoul of the emperor's gaze often did so with surprising quite no rebellions or open defiance, just sudden disappearances and whispered endings. Take, for instance, Lucius alias Sejanus. In the early 1st century CE, he rose with methodical grace through the ranks, becoming the trusted prefect of the Praetorian Guard under Emperor Tiberius. Sejanus was clever, too clever, many whispered. He was patient, deliberate, and unnervingly composed. As Tiberius withdrew from Rome to the island of Capri, it was Sejanus who remained at the heart of power. He began to remove rivals quietly, with the soft efficiency of a man shifting pieces on a board. He secured alliances, proposed marriages into the imperial family, and spoke carefully, always carefully. For years, he maneuvered just below the surface, cloaked in loyalty. But ambition, once visible, was dangerous. In 31 CE, a letter from Tiberius arrived in Rome. Its tone was subtle, its message cold. Sejanus was to be arrested. Within hours, he was taken from the Senate, stripped of titles, and executed. The news passed through the city like wind through wheat, silent and sudden. There were no trials. There was no defense, just the machinery of suspicion grinding to life. Sejanus's body was left on the Gemonian stairs, exposed to the public. The man who had once spoken softly in the ear of the emperor now lay still, his silence enforced by the very state he once served. But Sejanus was not the only one. Consider Agrippina, the younger wife of one emperor, mother to another. She was intelligent, educated, and shrewd, navigating the treacherous waters of court life with a skill few matched. But intelligence in a woman of her stature could arouse envy, and her proximity to power placed her on a knife's edge. Her son, Nero, once doting, came to see her as a threat. In time, he accused her of plotting against him. The allegations were vague, the evidence unseen. Yet in Rome, an accusation of treason did not need to be proven, it merely needed to be spoken. Agrippina was ordered to die. Her final moments are described with eerie calm by the historians. A failed attempt at drowning, followed by soldiers with blades, and a quiet, final breath in a villa by the sea. And so we see, treason in Rome often came not with banners or armed resistance, but with too much closeness, too much ambition, too much presence. Even Stoic philosophers, who seldom sought fame, were not safe. The teacher Seneca, once tutor to Nero, was later implicated in a plot he may never have supported. His crime? Association, perhaps. Or perhaps it was simply that he had lived too long. In the end, Seneca was allowed a dignified suicide, permitted to choose the manner of his own death. It was considered an act of grace. Here, in these stories, we do not linger on the sorrow, but observe instead how treason in Rome was less about law-breaking and more about disturbance, a disruption in the smooth surface of imperial control. And when such disruptions occurred, the response was not rage or spectacle. It was removal, silent, clinical, absolute. As we leave these figures behind, their lives etched in the margins of Rome's vast chronicle, we return to a softer place, a colonnade at dusk, the sound of sandals on marble, the hush of a world where, for most, the key to survival was to never be noticed at all. Even long after the voices of the condemned have faded, Rome whispers to us still through its stones, its artifacts, and the quiet work of time. In this segment, we listen not to laws or biographies, but to what remains, what lies buried beneath, sometimes literally, and sometimes just beneath the surface of our understanding. Much of what we know about Roman punishments for treason comes not from proclamations or trials, but from fragments, inscriptions chipped into weathered tablets, obscure references in satirical poems, and curious archaeological finds whose silence begs to be interpreted. In a quiet corner of the Palatine Hill, beneath layers of palatial splendor, archaeologists once uncovered a small hidden chamber. Its purpose is still debated. Some claim it was a storage room for scrolls. Others wonder if it was a holding cell, temporary, perhaps for those awaiting judgment. The walls bear no decoration, no adornment, just bare stone, silent, watchful. Then there are the lead curse tablets, thin sheets etched with appeals to gods of the underworld, asking for justice, vengeance, or silence. Some bear the names of imperial officials. Others mention betrayal, suspicion, or secret meetings. These were not public documents. They were buried in wells, tombs, or crossroads left as offerings to deities who might punish in ways the courts could not. One such tablet, recovered near ancient Ostia, reads only, "Let him speak no more of what he saw." Who he was, what he saw, and why his silence was desired, we do not know, but the weight of fear lingers in the scrawl. Roman culture had a deeply ritualistic understanding of justice. The punishment of traitors was not simply retribution, it was cleansing. A treasonous act, like a polluted stream, had to be redirected, purified, or sealed off. This extended into burial practices too. Those declared hostis, publicus public enemies, were often denied a proper tomb. Their names were erased from records, statues defaced, images smashed. To modern archaeologists, this practice, called damnatio memoriae, or condemnation of memories, paradoxical. It intended to make a person vanish, but in doing so, it left behind traces. One finds blank plinths where names were chiseled out, or frescoes where a face has been deliberately scratched away. In the Vatican museums today, there stands a statue base that once bore the name of an imperial favorite, now just gouged stone. No one is quite sure who it once honored, but the violence of its erasure is eloquent. Some remnants are more subtle. In Pompeii, the ash-preserved city silenced by Vesuvius, graffiti survives on plaster walls. Among the boasts and merchant advertisements are warnings: beware of spies. Speak softly in the baths. These casual messages, scrawled by common hands, tell us of a world where surveillance was not formalized, but ever present. A world where anyone might listen and where treason could be imagined or invented with ease. And so, the stones speak, not with clarity, but with suggestion. They offer hints of a society that moved smoothly on the surface, but hummed with quiet tension beneath. A coin with a scratched-out emperor's face, a cellar too small for storage, a name removed from a family tomb. These are not answers. They are questions in marble and metal. And if you listen carefully, very carefully, you can almost hear the hushed breath of history exhaling across the centuries. The law in Rome, though gilded in rhetoric and ritual, did not rest evenly upon all shoulders. To understand how treason was treated, it helps to observe the stark contrast between classes, between those who walked in purple-bordered togas and those who trudged through the mud in coarse tunics. The patrician, scion of a noble family, might live in a spacious domushi's walls painted with mythological scenes, his atrium echoing with the murmurs of clients come to pay their daily respects. He might dine on shellfish imported from the shores of Illyricum, reclining on a couch of cedar, discussing politics over honeyed wine. This man, if accused of treason, did not face the same fate as the man who cleaned his latrine or poured his drinks. Not immediately. First, there would be deliberations, questions of honor. The Senate might be convened. There could be letters exchanged, subtle negotiations, arrangements for an honorable death, such as voluntary exile or suicide behind closed doors. It was brutal, yes, but often draped in ceremony, a kind of quiet theatre, where dignity was preserved at least outwardly. By contrast, the plebeian, or worse, the enslaved, lived in a world of fewer protections and harsher certainties. Imagine a baker's apprentice, perhaps, working in the shadowed alleys of Subura. He rises before dawn, his hands rough from grinding grain. He knows little of imperial politics, but he hears rumors in the taverns. A cousin arrested, a neighbor questioned. If this man is accused of treason, perhaps for listening too closely, or failing to report a rumor, he may be taken swiftly. His case handled not in the Senate, but before a magistrate. There is no procession, no appeals to family honor. Punishment may be immediate and public. The Romans valued public example. The lower classes were often punished, not just to correct behavior, but to deter. Execution, exile to the mines, even forced labor in the aranastes were all tools in the imperial toolbox. And yet, curiously, even the powerful were not immune. Under emperors like Caligula and Domitian, paranoia seeped through every stratum of Roman life. Senators, governors, philosophers, and generals alike could find themselves suddenly accused. In these eras, even noble lineage could become a liability. If one had influence, wealth, or popularity, one might be seen as a threat. This created a curious inversion, where the humble survived by invisibility, the powerful perished by proximity. In time, certain classes developed their own codes of silence and survival. Patrician families taught their sons to speak cautiously in public. Slaves, who were tortured under questioning, learned to dissemble. Freedmen built networks of whispered warnings. Justice in Rome was deeply hierarchical, but fear was democratic. It reached the villa and the tenement, the bathhouse and the Senate floor, and it taught every citizen, noble or obscure, that treason was not always about action. Sometimes it was about simply being seen. Rome prided itself on order. Even its punishments, however cruel, were wrapped in the language of law, procedure, and precedent. Treason, or maestas, as the Romans called it, was not merely a crime. It was a violation of the majesty, the dignity, of the Roman state and its leader. At its heart, maestas minuta populi Romani, the diminishing of the majesty of the Roman people, was a charge both specific and terribly vague. It encompassed a wide array of acts: conspiring against the emperor, insulting him, mishandling military commands, forging documents, even failure to report a plot. Over time, it expanded until it could ensnare nearly anyone, for nearly anything. The Lex Julia de Maestate, introduced during the late Republic and refined under Augustus, formalized the process. It was Rome's way of giving a robe of civility to the beast of political control. Trials were held before the Senate or special courts, and procedures were observed. There were witnesses, there were charges. Sometimes there was even a defense. But beneath the surface, the outcomes were often already written. In times of political stability, these trials might be cautious, even rare. But during the reigns of suspicious emperors, Tiberius, Nero, Domitian, became engines of fear. Informants were rewarded. A whisper could become an indictment, and once named, a citizen could find his property confiscated, his family disinherited, his name reduced to a smear in an official scroll. Interestingly, Roman law permitted even encouraged accusers, called delatores, to profit from their denunciations. If the accused was convicted, the accuser could receive a portion of his estate. This system, meant to ensure vigilance, quickly devolved into a network of opportunists and rivals. Some citizens, once respected, became known only for their accusations. They would sit in the courts, like vultures watching for the stumble of a colleague, ready to pounce with the prepared list of offences and names. This encouraged a culture not of justice, but of self-preservation. Citizens grew cautious in speech. Poets published under pseudonyms or buried their manuscripts. Letters were burned. Dinner conversations were scrubbed of political comment. Loyalty became not just a sentiment, but a performance, a daily ritual of alignment with imperial will. And still, the law loomed. Quiet, precise, waiting. Executions were not always dramatic. Some were announced in short notices. Others occurred behind closed doors. A man might be found dead in his villa, a polite fiction recorded in official records. He chose to end his life. Sometimes this was true. Often, it was not. And if an individual chose to take his own life before a verdict was reached, his property might be spared, his family spared humiliation. It was considered an act of gratia, final offering to the state he had allegedly betrayed. Thus, the law in Rome was not designed for mercy, but for containment. It held the shape of justice, while performing the function of fear. Even as the empire expanded, its legal language remained tightly bound to its imperial center. Inscriptions in far-off provinces repeat the same phrasing, the same penalties. A man in Gaul or Syria could be accused of maestas just as easily as one in the Forum. And yet, the deeper one studies these laws, the more one senses the fragile balance beneath them. A civilization of astonishing structure and ambition, shadowed always by the fear that it could be undone not from outside, but from within. Treason, then, was not only a crime. It was the crack in the marble, the whisper behind the curtain, the reminder that even Rome, for all its laws, feared the silence of dissent. While Roman law often wrapped punishment in solemnity and procedure, the consequences of treason were sometimes unveiled in full view. For a state built on power and permanence, visibility mattered. It wasn't enough to punish Rome needed its people to see. Public execution was not always the preferred method for elite offenders, but for others, particularly those whose alleged betrayal stirred fear or outrage, it became a kind of dark theatre, a warning written in flesh and dust. Let us imagine the Forum Romanum in the late afternoon light. The marble columns cast long shadows across the paving stones. A crowd has gathered, not rowdy, not cheering, but watchful. Here, a convicted traitor may be led forth, his sentence already known, his fate sealed not by jury, but decree. The Romans, unlike later civilizations, were rarely gratuitous in violence for its own sake, but they believed firmly in consequence and in example. Some forms of punishment, such as crucifixio, were rarely used for citizens, more often reserved for slaves and rebels. Yet in moments of crisis, Rome could stretch its own boundaries. A citizen stripped of his status might find himself bound to wood, not only to suffer, but to be seen suffering. More commonly, those convicted of maestas were punished through exilium banishment, not always to another city, but sometimes to an isolated island, removed from networks of influence and communication. The islands of Pandateria and Pontia, small, windswept and bleak, became names whispered in dread. To be sent there was to vanish slowly. Others were assigned to labour in quarries or mines, often until death. There was no appeal, no return. For the elite, suicide was offered a death behind closed doors, preserving dignity, at least in name. The element of performance, even in such grimness, was never absent. A notable example lies in the damnatio memoriae, formal condemnation of memory. It was punishment not of the body, but of the legacy. Statues were pulled down, coins were melted, names were erased from stone, as if the individual had never lived. But ironically, this effort to remove a person from history often preserved them more powerfully. We remember them because they were erased. There are records of entire family lines blotted out. Fathers, mothers, and sons who bore the stigma of an accused relative. A single charge of treason could unravel years of status, reducing a proud name to a cautionary tale. Even in daily life, punishment left its traces. An accused man's house might be seized, his servants sold, his portraits destroyed. To pass by the empty villa of a disgraced senator was to be reminded of Rome's reach and its cold indifference. Public monuments sometimes bore inscriptions praising the emperor for protecting the state against those who conspired. These inscriptions rarely named the traitor, but everyone knew. Silence and spectacle, hand in hand. There was also the peculiar ritual of parading a traitor's likeness through the streets, only to destroy it publicly. Not the man himself, but his effigy, a symbolic act, a kind of civic cleansing. To the Roman mind, punishment was not just for the guilty, it was for the observers. It was to preserve order, to affirm loyalty, and to caution ambition. Even as we imagine these events, we do so from a distance. The crowd disperses. The stones cool in the evening shade. A child asks a question his mother does not answer, and life, as it always did in Rome, moves on. For the empire had no time to mourn its traitors. It had too many others to watch. Treason in Rome did not always come from distant corners of the empire, or from jealous senators in shadowy halls. Often, its sharpest blades were drawn in the softest places, in bedrooms, in banquets, in whispered moments behind silk curtains. Within the imperial family itself, treason was not only feared, it was expected. From Augustus to the later emperors, the Palatine Hill, where the imperial residences sprawled in gilded opulence, was as much a battleground as any frontier. Imagine the imperial palace at twilight, walls painted with delicate frescoes, oil lamps casting flickering shadows along colonnaded corridors. It seems serene, and yet, beneath that calm, political survival required constant vigilance. Family members dined together by day and plotted at night. A misstep, a misplaced confidence, even an unintended slight could begin a cascade that ended in exilia worse. The Emperor Augustus, known for his careful governance, exiled his own daughter Julia for moral treason. The official charge was adultery, but beneath it lay deeper fears that her affairs might lead to alliances, and alliances to rival claims of power. She was sent to the barren island of Pandateria. Her name was stripped from official records. She would die there, unremembered by the state. Claudius, the quiet and often underestimated emperor, married Agrippina, the younger his own Nicene, an alliance meant to stabilize succession. But Agrippina had other plans. She sought power not for Claudius, but for her son, Nero. When Claudius began to show preference for another heir, he died, quietly, suspiciously. Some say poisoned by a dish of mushrooms, the food of the gods. The truth remains buried beneath layers of speculation and silence. Under Nero's rule, treason charges bloomed like mold on damp stone. His own mother, once his protector, was later accused and eliminated. His wife, Octavia, exiled and executed. His tutor, Seneca, pushed toward suicide. Even emperors feared treason and sometimes committed it themselves. Domitian, the stern and suspicious ruler of the late 1st century, was obsessed with plots. He surrounded himself with spies. He punished whispers, yet it was his own servants, including members of the imperial household, who orchestrated his end. The man who saw traitors everywhere could not prevent betrayal beneath his own roof. To be born into the imperial family was not necessarily to be blessed. It was to enter a quiet arena, where danger wore perfume and smiled politely. Young princes were schooled not just in rhetoric and letters, but in survival. They learned to speak carefully, to flatter without fawning, to avoid both ambition and indifference. There was no winning strategy, only endurance. Even empresses and daughters were not spared. Their marriages were arranged not for love, but for political balance. And when balance shifted, they could be discarded, imprisoned, or worse. And yet, in this hush of danger, life continued. Gardens were tended, music played in marble atria, children laughed in courtyards, because Rome, even in its most fearful corridors, understood the necessity of appearances. The imperial family became a stage upon which loyalty was constantly performed. Treason, in this context, was not always an action. It could be a glance, a hesitation, a pause too long when asked a question. The air in the palace was scented with myrrh, and roses, but beneath that sweetness hung the faint metallic tang of unease. And so the family at the heart of the empire lived not in comfort, but in quiet caution, surrounded by wealth, but never trust. For in Rome, the knife of treason was most often hidden in a golden sleeve. As Rome began its long descent from the polished order of empire to the uncertain tremors of fragmentation, the machinery of treason, too, began to change. What had once been a weapon of supreme authority, sharply aimed, neatly justified, became, over time, blunted, distorted, and exhausted. In the later centuries of the Roman Empire, as borders grew porous and emperors rose and fell with alarming speed, accusations of treason became more frequent and less meaningful. The charge remained, but its purpose grew diffuse. The rhythm of governance shifted. Imagine the 4th century. The empire is formally split into eastern and western halves, governed from Ravenna and Constantinople. Bureaucracy thickens like dust on a neglected scroll. The Senate still meets, but its voice grows quieter. The emperors, now more isolated behind layers of court ritual and Christian doctrine, wield power with increasing suspicion. Treason still exists, but now it must compete with other forces: religious heresy, barbarian incursions, and economic disarray. Fear remains, but it is more scattered, less surgical. In earlier centuries, the charge of maestas had been a refined tool, politically expedient, legally potent. But as political authority becomes fragmented, treason becomes both more common and more chaotic. Accusations are flung not just at senators or philosophers, but at generals returning from failed campaigns, at bishops with unpopular doctrines, at soldiers who falter at the frontier. It is no longer about protecting the emperor's dignity. It becomes about survival, about shifting blame, deflecting failure. By the time of the 5th century, Rome itself has been sacked. The Western Empire shudders beneath the weight of its own contradictions. The last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, is quietly deposed in 476 CE. He is not executed. He is not paraded through the streets. He is simply sent away, another faint echo in the long corridor of imperial decline. With him, the language of treason begins to fade. It does not vanish, but it no longer bears the same imperial weight. The laws survive in name, and later societies will adapt them, reshape them, and revive them. But the grandeur of Roman treason, with its solemn trials, poetic erasures, and cold performances, begins to dissolve into the broader story of collapse. Still, in quiet monasteries and candlelit scriptoria, monks copy old laws onto vellum. The term maestas remains. The examples are preserved. And even centuries later, medieval kings and popes will reach into those same Roman shadows when accusing their own enemies of betrayal. But by then, the voices are no longer Roman. They are filtered through time, through parchment, through silence. The marble that once bore names now crumbles. The coins are corroded, their faces barely visible. The villas lie in ruin, overtaken by earth and wildflowers. And the punishments so carefully designed, so pointedly displayed, fade into abstraction. Treason, in the end, becomes not a legal form, but a whisper through the centuries, a lesson, a warning, a fading imprint on the stone surface of empire. As we now step gently back from that vast and ancient world, the clamour softens, the voices diminish, and the shadows of those who stood accused finally rest. And now, as the final echoes of Rome recede into the soft mist of history, let your mind rest easy. The cobbled streets have emptied, the torchlight in the forum has dimmed, the whispering walls of the Senate stand quiet, their judgments long past. Where once the weight of accusation hung heavy in the air, there is now stillness. Where once names were erased, only smooth stone remains. Treason in Rome was not just about rebellion, it was about identity, about what it meant to belong, to obey, to survive within a structure that demanded loyalty, yet offered so little safety in return. It was a slow erosion, not always swift or loud. Often, it was as subtle as a bowed head, a cautious phrase, a face turned slightly away. And now, far from that world, you are here in your time, in your space, free from the burdens of imperial politics, the performance of allegiance, and the silent weight of suspicion. There are no delatores listening, no statues watching, only quiet, only calm. The people of Rome lived in a world that prized order over truth, obedience over comfort. Their punishments, though cruel, were part of a system that feared the very thing it built, power. But tonight, you can simply breathe. The past, however intricate, cannot reach you here. Its lessons, its shadows, its ancient fears, they are behind glass now, on museum shelves, or buried deep beneath layers of soil and time. Let those layers comfort you. Let the dust of centuries settle gently over the day behind you. For Rome has fallen, and its punishments have passed. And you are safe, and still, and free to sleep. Good night.